This is the online flash version of my paper, A Body of Texts, Memento and Mētis, presented by me, Jeremy Tirrell, at the 2006 Midwest Interdisciplinary Graduate Conference, the theme of which was Archival Bodies, and it was held at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'd like to begin by looking at these two quotations, the first of which is from Derrida's Archive Fever. Let us not begin at the beginning, nor even at the archive. And the second quotation is from Carolyn Steedman's Dust. Desire for the archive is presented as part of the desire to find or locate or possess that moment of origin as the beginning of things. One of the main themes of this presentation is this notion of starting from fragments and working towards a totalizing narrative of origin. And of course that's a central theme to Derrida's Archive Fever, particularly in his examination of psychoanalytic thought. Specifically in this presentation we're looking at the film Memento, and here we see the movie's promotional poster. It's also the cover of the standard edition DVD. And we can see in reference to the previous two quotations the maison-à-beam arrangement of the Polaroid photographs here, stretching backwards as if to reach some sort of foundational representation, but of course not reaching it. If you're not familiar with the plot of this film, that's fine. Hopefully the presentation isn't going to be examining the film as an object, but rather using it as a kind of lens through which we can generate a kind of model of the self that's applicable beyond the boundaries of the film. Just to provide a few words of summary, Memento came out in 2000. It's directed by Christopher Nolan. Sometimes it's put in the genre of neo-noir. It is something of a detective story in the vein of the older noir movies. Essentially, the plot is this man, shown in the photo here, Leonard Shelby, is the main character. He interrupts two burglars in his home who are in the process of raping and ultimately killing his wife. He attempts to stop this from going on, and they attack him, the result of which is he develops a brain injury. He survives, but is left with a mental disorder called anterograde amnesia. This is a real disorder. It's rare, but essentially the gist of it is that the patient can't create any new memories. The patient can't move anything from his or her attention span into long-term memory. And the bulk of the film is taken up with Mr. Shelby's attempt to track down the man responsible for this and kill him, extract revenge on it. This makes for interesting filmmaking because every few minutes or so Mr. Shelby is a kind of tabula rasa. He can remember his life up until the accident, but everything after that fades very, very quickly. This also, of course, puts Mr. Shelby's status as narrator into question. I mean, he's something of the epitome of the untrustworthy narrator. The film is probably best known for its unusual chronology, and we can see a breakdown of its presentation on this slide. This notation is borrowed from Andy Klein's Everything You Wanted to Know About Memento. Sometimes it's stated that the movie runs backwards. The film does not actually run backwards. Snippets of time are taken out of order and then assembled in an achronological fashion, but they do run forward, save for the first scene, the credits scene. One convenient way of thinking about it may be as akin to the cars on a train. If we were to take, say, the locomotive and move it to the back of the train, and then the coal car and move it to the back of the train, they'd all still be proceeding in the same way, but the order would be shaken up. We can see that in the heading here, film presentation. The credits scene actually does run in reverse. It runs as if being rewound. We then shift to the first chronological moment. We can see it represented there with a 1, which is a black and white scene. The film then skips to the second to the last chronological moment, which is indicated with a V, which is a color scene. The movement then proceeds in that order, 2U, 3T, essentially working towards the middle. The final scene presented shifts from the black and white chronologically correct or in order scenes to the color chronologically backward scenes. We can see that the film here is representing in form Leonard's mental condition, in that we as the audience members are frequently in a similar state of confusion. We'll be seeing perhaps a person for what we think is the first time, but as the chronology unfolds, it turns out that this person is Leonard's best friend or something like that, just as he doesn't recognize these things because of his mental condition, because everything is new to him every few minutes. We're also put in that same situation. So what's important about this structure is that, like Leonard, we, the audience, are put in a situation where we're presented with incoherent data, essentially. Fragments which we must weave into some sort of totalizing narrative in order to exist, in order to proceed. So the film, and we as audience members, like Leonard, are struggling to get to some sort of totalizing narrative, some sort of point of origin that we can work out of. I think we can see something of Leonard's processes in another pair of quotations, again from Steedman and Derrida. Steedman states, Derrida sees in Freud's writing the very desire that is archive fever, the desire to recover moments of inception, to find and possess all sorts of beginnings. And Derrida states in Archive Fever, the archontic power, which also gathers the functions of unification, of identification, of classification, must be paired with what we will call the power of consignation, gathering together signs. I think these are important quotations because this notion of possession that Steedman mentions in her quotation certainly is at play in Leonard's weaving together of archival data into a coherent narrative. That is to say, the only way Leonard can function, isolated from memory as he is through a kind of perpetual assembling of a bodily archive. Leonard has an extensive list of notes and photos and such that we'll take a look at, and the only way he can exist is by putting these together into a coherent narrative. Here we see an image that I think really brings home this notion of possessible memory. This is the cover of the special edition DVD, and we see that it's set up as a sort of case file. It's got Leonard's name on it. Even the discs themselves are printed with some sort of personality test. And I think this taps into Steedman's notion of possessing origins. And of course it also plays upon the multiple meanings of the word memento itself. Its original connection is of course with memory, but its more common association now is with a kind of tangible artifact that is in some way imbued with a memory. So these notions of tangible, possessible memory are very much at play in Archive Fever, in Steedman's Dusk, and very much in Leonard's own life, given that he has no memory the way we conceive of it. His memory is essentially displaced into this bodily archive, his notes, his photos. Leonard is, in a metaphorical, if not literal sense, the archive made flesh, and this image sort of introduces that concept to us. Here we see two shots of Leonard with one of the prime pieces in his bodily archive, his police file. This is a close-up of a couple of different shots of the contents of Leonard's police file. We can see at the bottom his psychiatric report, and then the two shots above have different handwritten elements. Earlier in the film, Leonard states that he can't keep it all in mind at once, the entire case, so he has to write himself summaries. And he admits that because he's so dependent on these documents in his bodily archive, he could be easily misled by a fabricated document or something like that. And he states that you learn to trust your own handwriting. And he talks about the positioning of certain photos that he puts in his jacket. You need a jacket with a lot of pockets for certain items. Again, this connects his document archive with the body. The trust in his own handwriting becomes the means to veracity. This is a fact because he can recognize his own hand. In these further shots we can see, for example, in the middle a list of missing pages, and then at the bottom some blacked out text. This is important because, like any archive, Leonard's bodily archive has gaps, and those gaps form the space into which narrative must fit. That is to say, in order to create a coherent story, those gaps have to be filled. And that's done through narrative, through fiction, despite Leonard's explicit statement that he does not operate that way, that he operates solely on facts. Here we see another large component of Leonard's archive, Polaroid photos, onto which he writes notes. such as this one, which states, "Don't believe his lies, he is the one, kill him." And there are more mundane messages such as, "Shave." Here we see some shots of Leonard's map, and I think this is an important metaphor or element in that this map does have geographical relationships. It shows images and where they are. We see Spruce Street on the one in the middle and Ferdy's Bar and such, but it also maps relationships. We see images of Dodd in the bottom image next to the car. We see a particular kind of mapping going on here that I think is important because it's a mapping of Leonard's self. Not just geographical locations, but a web of connections that constitutes the very identity of Leonard. And here we see perhaps the most explicit part of Leonard's bodily archive, and something for which the movie was well known, the tattoos on his body. Here we have a man who is constituted of textual fragments. Some of them we might notice are "Find him and kill him," and on his left arm, "She is gone, time still passes," which is a recurring theme. Leonard expresses that he is unable to feel the passage of time without memory. So how can he heal? Perhaps another very important one for our purposes is on his right bicep, which states, "Consider the source, memory is treachery." This is, again, a recurrent theme, that memory is somehow fallible in light of the facts, and this goes back to the notion of gaps being in the bodily archive. Leonard earlier in the movie states about the fallibility of memory, facts, not memories. Memories are an interpretation, not a record, and they're irrelevant if you have the facts. And in this slide we can see that Leonard does indeed have the facts. He has them tattooed on his body. Fact 1 male, fact 2 white. He has 5 or 6 of these textual fragments tattooed on his body about the man he's hunting. Leonard is in fact constituted of facts. We can't see it too clearly on the top image, but around his belly button, in fact, there is a tattoo that says "Eat," that he can read. That's, I think, interesting because, again, something that we would assume is so very bodily, so very fundamental, for him is displaced into these textual fragments. His very physical existence is these textual fragments. And because of that, because he is made of the facts, because he doesn't trust memory or subjectivity, we might be tempted to view Mr. Shelby here as a figure of modernism. The personal, the self, is totally effaced, and objective fact is allowed to constitute the one true narrative. However, the movie really complicates that perspective. Not only the gaps, which we have to recognize are spaces for narrative, for fiction, but we also, during the course of the movie, discover that these facts that make up Leonard are very much unstable. This instability that is inherent in Leonard's self begs the question, who or what is he? And I think a couple of quotations can help us with that question. First is from Derrida's Archive Fever again, and it states, "It accumulates so many sedimented archives, some of which are written right on the epidermis of a body proper, others on the substrate of an exterior body." And a second one from Douglas Copeland's novel Microsurfs, and Copeland states, "I don't believe human beings store memory in our brains exclusively. There simply aren't enough storage slots or interconnective possibilities. And so if not in the brain, then where? I concluded that another viewpoint on memory was to see our bodies as peripheral memory storage devices." I think both of these quotations are important because they introduce the notion that Leonard is not just his flesh, right? His flesh is made up of textual fragments, but Leonard encompasses a much bigger sphere. The photos that we saw, the police file, the notes, all of these things in a very real way are Leonard. This is the exterior body to which Derrida refers, as well as the body being a peripheral memory storage device. But I think we can see the body not just as the skin and bone, but quite literally as all these other bits and pieces, these fragments that constitute a self. I think this allows us to see Leonard as a collection, an assemblage of fragments. And this recalls what Andy Clark, in his book Being There, identifies as the mingling of brain, body, and world. And this conception of the self as a collection or an assemblage is by no means unique to Clark. On this slide we can see the label posthumanism, although I doubt any of these people outside of perhaps Hales would label themselves as post-humanists, and yet the ideas are there. Copeland, this is another quotation from his work Microserfs, which states, "The one thing that differentiates human beings from all other creatures on Earth is the externalization of subjective memory, first through notches in trees, then through cave paintings, then through the written word, and now through databases of almost otherworldly storage and retrieval power." And this notion of externalizing the self is very much at play in Clarke's works, both Being There and his other work, Natural Born Cyborgs, wherein he refers to humans as human technology symbionts, thinking and reasoning systems whose minds and selves are spread across biological brain and non-biological circuitry. These same issues are at play in Hutchins' extended example of a ship pulling into port and the interrelationship between human and non-human components. Very much in Hales, How I Became Post-Human, these notions recur. Even in Heidegger's dense concept of dwelling in the world or being in the world, we see a notion of creatures as indivisible from their environment. The last two names up there, Csikszentmihalyi and Rochberg-Halton, are perhaps a little less theoretical, but are no less invested in post-humanist ideas. They actually are empirical researchers who looked at the meaning of objects in people's lives from a kind of sociological standpoint. This is a quotation from their work, The Meaning of Things. "Men and women make order in themselves, i.e. retrieve their identity, by first creating and then interacting with the material world. The nature of that transaction will determine, to a great extent, the kind of person that emerges. Thus, the things that surround us are inseparable from who we are." And so from all of these authors, we get a very different notion of the self than we've inherited from Descartes and from the Enlightenment. We get a picture of the self as a collection or a network, rather than a hermetic thinking entity. These two diagrams perhaps make that difference clear. We should keep in mind that Leonard is, in very real ways, constituted of his archive. He's made up of his photos, his text fragments, his tattoos, these sorts of things. This is important because, as we can see from the diagram here, Leonard's mementos possess him as much as the converse. And this is a different arrangement from the kind of Cartesian or Lockean hermetic observer of external phenomenon. In the post-human model, the self becomes constituted by the very thing it observes, which is the archive. At this point, we can turn to the concept that started off the presentation, Mētis. And in order to discuss Mētis, I think we have to also talk about the notion of kairos. There are a couple of quotations that I think can help us out. The first is from Haughey's Kairotic Encounters. "In the middle, one invents and is invented, one writes and is written, constitutes and is constituted." And the second is from Détienne and Vernant's Cunning Intelligence, which is one of the few studies of Mētis out there. "The sophist embodies the scheming intelligence of the man of Mētis, plunged into the world of appearance and becoming." These notions of perpetually becoming or constituting and being constituted are important. Kairos is a concept that is somewhat lost in contemporary culture, but it essentially translates to the right moment for something, a fitness of time versus a duration. If Chronos is a duration, then Kairos is the quality of it. Mētis, then, is the ability of a person to suit the kairotic event or moment. Haughey defines Mētis as the ability to maneuver or act on the spot in the heat of the moment. And there are some figures who are traditionally associated with Mētis, such as the fox. The fox is still somewhat known for his tricky ability, clever like a fox, that sort of thing. The octopus is one for his shape-shifting ability, his transformation, also his ability to grapple. There's a certain bodily element to Mētis, which Haughey does a great job looking at in bodily arts. Odysseus is another classical figure. He's often depicted as wily intelligent. He's able to utilize his environment to his advantage. Someone who I think we can look at as a modern example is MacGyver, who everyone may not remember, but he was a television character who would get himself into fixes of one sort or another, and was able to use his environment in order to get out of whatever fix he was in. He would put together, the shoelaces and a toothpaste in order to make an explosive. So he is someone who I think is a great modern figure of Mētis. I think these two quotations, both of which are from Haughey's Bodily Arts, are helpful when we want to apply the concept of Mētis to someone like Leonard Shelby. The first one states, as Détienne and Vernon suggest, Mētis emerges only from shifting or ambiguous situations, thus eluding logical apprehension. And the second is, or to put it more bluntly, Odysseus is always becoming something else. In a bizarre twist, his proclamation to Polyphemus that he is no one in particular is fairly accurate. So this notion of being protean, I think, is very key, and we can see that very clearly, I hope, in Leonard Shelby. And this is really the crux of what I'd like to get at in this presentation, is that Mr. Shelby is thrown into a perpetual kairotic moment, and he must rely on his Mētic ability to weave together his bodily archive of fragments into some sort of coherent narrative. Because of his memory deficiency, he is always in a kairotic moment. He is always in this shifting or ambiguous situation. He must always be protean. He must always be Odysseus or the fox or MacGyver for that matter, and use this bodily archive that he has built up in order to construct a coherent narrative. Mētis is Leonard Shelby's sole means of creating a self. In closing, I should state that like any rhetorician, I really haven't provided any answers, but I think perhaps we can recapitulate the kinds of questions that are before us. I think we can see, as implied by Derrida and Steedman, the archive as the quest to assemble fragments into a coherent narrative of origin. I think we can also see the self as something other than the hermetic Cartesian or Lockean entity we've inherited from the Enlightenment. We can see it as is implied by posthumanism, something constructed of a broader network, an emergent thing that is the result of a diffused body of fragments. If we view the self in this way, I think, Mētis becomes a very crucial concept, because it's the ability to weave these fragments of ourselves into some sort of coherent whole, into some sort of totalizing narrative. Indeed, I think the contemporary applicability of this notion is revealed in William Arnold's review of Memento, where he suggests that it's possible to view Leonard, covered in tattoos as he is, as a metaphor for the increasing number of passwords and number codes that now constitute our lives. And if we think about that, there's a lot of resonance. What are we as people if not our passwords and our PIN numbers and our logins and our credit scores? I think Arnold's statement is pretty telling, really. To close, I'd just like to suggest then that Mētis is our own mode of living. It is our continual act of becoming or of weaving together our diffused selves into semi-stable narratives. It's as true for us, I would say, as it is for Leonard Shelby. Thank you very much, and if you would like to provide feedback, I would love to hear it. Please feel free to visit my website at jtirrell.com. Thank you again.